Thank you very much. And thank you to our panel. I just wanted to unpack this notion that being a non-EU member of the European Economic Area makes a country a rule taker. I suppose the first point would be that most single market legislation is passed by qualified majority voting. So the United Kingdom as a member state doesn't have a veto on single market legislation, and therefore by definition is a rule taker if there's a piece of legislation that it's opposed to, but it's not able to form a blocking minority. As a non-EU member of the European Economic Area, the United Kingdom would have an independent voice on global standards bodies. So we would no longer be represented by the EU on those global standards bodies. And of course, as you've said, many of the EU's positions flow from those positions on global standards bodies. So there would be an influencing opportunity for the United Kingdom far greater than we currently have through membership of the European Union. Only about 30% of EU rules apply to non-EU members of the European Economic Area, because of course there's no common agricultural policy, no common fisheries policy, which generate vast amounts of legislation. There is no direct effect when you are in the EEA and not in the EU. The EFTA Court is not obliged to follow European Court of Justice decisions. New EEA law is only incorporated with the unanimous agreement of the EEA-EFTA member states. Norway has obtained derogations from 55 legal acts up until June 2011, Iceland 349. These include the third energy package, third postal service directive, and the hygiene package, just to give some examples. And each country has a right of reservation, so new EEA legislation would have, if the United Kingdom were out of the EU but in the EEA, the British Parliament would have to pass all new EEA legislation based on debating and voting in the normal way in this Parliament. So, given all of that, would you agree that it's quite a lazy description of being EEA but not EU as a rule taker? Perhaps I could ask Mr. Klepper to comment on that.
Sure, thank you. This is, of course, these are arguments that you often hear, and I don't think there's any doubt that there are some advantages in EFTA EEA in terms of sovereignty as compared to the EU. For example, the right to derogation. But then the right to reservation. But the right to reservation is really only a right to delay. For example, Norway managed to delay the implementation of the postal liberalization directive, but ultimately it had to fold. The current NATO Secretary General, I'm sure you know his quote, Jens Stoltenberg, he has been saying when he was Prime Minister of Norway that his own country was a fax democracy. Now again, you're right that at the moment, if you're a member of the EU, there's already QMV, so there you don't have a veto. But what is very important in this is that as an EFTA EEA member state, one is obliged to take over 100% of the relevant legislation. Now it is true that many of the European Union rules are not relevant to countries like Iceland, Norway, and there's often a bit of haggling about the question, is this piece of legislation actually relevant or not? But fundamentally, if regulations are relevant, an EFTA EEA member state has to apply it. Also, what you often hear is that yes, but then if the UK would be in EFTA EEA, it would have more power to shape global standards, which is true. And those global standards often inspire EU regulations. But then I often respond with the argument that in Geneva you don't have 30,000 lobbyists. So apparently industry finds that ultimately where you need to be to shape legislation is in Brussels. It's not in Geneva or other places where you have these global standards. So I think ultimately, I personally, I may be wrong, but I don't see a country the size of the UK that this model would be a sustainable fit, perhaps as a transition. But ultimately, I think it would be very complicated.
Yes, maybe Sarah, yeah.
I was just going to say that I didn't say the rule taker comment, and it's not really how the TUC thinks about things, but it's clear that we live in a globalised world, and no country gets its own way on things at all, and there's strength in numbers. So the way we see it is essentially, whose gang do you want to be in? You've got Trump's America, you've got China, you've got the EU. In terms of, there can be different forms of relationship, but in terms of history, in terms of shared values, in terms of proximity, a close relationship with the EU, it seems to us, as one that's going to much better serve our country than one of those other sort of alliances.
Thank you. Mr. Perez.
Just a couple of points. I don't disagree with anything you said in sort of list of points about how the EEA agreement works. I think it's worth sort of just working out why there is a difference of view about this, where you get such different perspectives, and some people describing it as a rule taker and some people not. Part of the reason for that is simply that because at the moment the EEA 3 are two very small countries indeed and one quite small country, the large parts of the EEA agreement are simply not being tested. So there is an open question about how large parts of it would actually work with a very large member state as opposed to three very small ones. It's worth remembering that when the EEA was originally set up, it was designed not to deal with one quite small state and two very small states, but actually quite a large number of medium-sized states. It was envisaged that Sweden and Austria and Switzerland and Finland would all be in it, and for various reasons they disappeared off in different directions, leaving just the three, and because of and three quite unusual economies as well, so large areas of which those countries are simply not interested at all. So that needs to mean, when one looks at large parts of the EEA agreement and one asks sort of fundamental questions about what would happen if, the answer is we don't really know. It's never happened. So that's one point. The second point, I think, is that it's important when thinking about the EEA. In the end, it's going to be a comparative exercise, not an absolute one. You've got to measure that model against other models that may or may not be available. And in any regime where we're in level playing field territory, dynamic alignment, there will be the UK will be the smaller party vis-à-vis the EU. The EU is A, bigger, B, has legal difficulties of its own in agreeing ever to be influenced by a third country because of the principle of autonomy of EU law. So any model of dynamic alignment, aligning to the single market, whatever that means, whatever one's thinking of, there will be a relationship where the UK is reacting to EU developments and under some form of obligation to follow, which may be qualified, limited in various ways. And the question one has to ask is whether that model that one comes up with is better or worse than the EEA model. In the end, that's a political question, but that's the right question to ask, rather than is the EEA turn the UK into a rule taker.
I completely agree with that last point, because this isn't an absolutist debate, it's a relative debate. It's not this option is going to be the perfect world for everybody. It's much more about, compared to the other options, is this the one that most people could live with? And I specifically wanted to just follow that on the issue of jurisdiction and the role of the European Court of Justice vis-à-vis the EFTA Court, and obviously that there is no direct effect in the EFTA-EEA countries. And given the legal expertise that we have on the panel as well, it'd be interesting to just unpack that a little bit more. Could you say a bit more about how you see the dynamics of the relationship between the European Court of Justice and the EFTA Court? And I know it's a bit difficult to do crystal ball gazing, but imagine for a moment that the United Kingdom were a member of the EFTA Court, but not a member state of the European Union. What effect do you think that might have on the relative relationship between the two jurisdictions? I don't know who's best. Is that maybe you again? Sorry, Mr. Perez. Yeah.
Well, I suppose the question about courts, I bear in front of them, I suppose it falls to me. One feature of the UK being in the EEA arrangement would be that there would be a UK judge on the EFTA court. It also deals with a problem that one hits in negotiating other forms of arrangement with the EU, which is the principle that the EU, when it comes to questions of EU law, as a matter almost as a EU constitutional law, the ECJ has to be the final arbiter. Now, the EFTA court is a very sort of clever way through that, which has got the approval of the European Court of Justice as a mechanism, which allows another court to apply EU law, effectively EU law, EEA law, in parallel with the ECJ. So there are attractions to that mechanism, particularly if one's concerned that by an arrangement that leaves the UK subject to what might be characterised as a foreign court, one which no UK presence at all. If the EFTA court had a UK judge on it, it would be an international court rather than a foreign court, really. There's also, because the EFTA court hears many, many fewer cases than the ECJ and always sits on bank, all three of them sit. There would be a UK judge in every case, which is not the case in the ECJ, where there's a UK judge only in a minority of cases, because the ECJ hardly ever sits in a court of 28 for very obvious reasons. So one might argue that the UK influence might be maintained, even possibly increased, under an arrangement where it was playing a full part in the EFTA court. I mean, one's got to be careful about this sort of thing, because it's anyway wrong in principle to assume that a UK judge will decide things in the interests of the UK. That's entirely wrong. Judges are very independent. It's very difficult to comment on particular judges because the ECJ and the EFTA court deliver all their judgments collectively, so the fingerprints of an individual judge are never on the judgments. So one's indulging in a bit of guesswork here rather than anything else, and one must avoid stereotypes about what particular judges decide. But I think one could sort of broadly maintain the point, and it's a point of political comfort at least, that there would be a UK judge sitting on a court taking important decisions.
Thank you very much.